So far, we've learned how to create components and how to make them interactive, and work the user input, which are the events and the input elements. Using this knowledge will take us a long way in building sites with React components, but we'll notice that certain annoyances do crop up. And this is especially true for large projects when we rely on components created by other software engineers. This is Lesson 7, where we're going to be speaking about scaling React components. Can you believe that we're almost finished with our second module of the course? In today's lesson, we're going to examine default properties for components, and then explore React property types and validation. And then we'll move on to viewing the steps for rendering children, and we'll finish off with creating higher order components for code reuse. When we consume a component that someone else wrote, how do we know whether we're providing the right properties for it? Also, how can we use an existing component with a little added functionality, which is also applied to other components? These questions are pretty important if we'd like to learn how to effectively build a complex React component. Let's imagine that we're building a date picker component that takes a few required properties such as number of rows, locale, and current date, like this. So what would happen if a new team member tries to use our component but forgets to pass the essential current date property? And also, what if another coworker passes a for string instead of a for number? Our component will do nothing due to the values being undefined, or even worse, it may crash. Sadly, this isn't an uncommon situation in web development, because JavaScript is a loosely typed language, as we know. However, fortunately, on the flip side of that coin, React does provide a feature for that. We set default values for properties, the default props static attribute. So the key benefit of default props is that if a property is missing, a default value is rendered. To set a default property value on the component class, we define default props, like this. For example, in the datePicker component definition that we just looked at, we can add a static class attribute. To illustrate default props a little bit further, let's say we have a component that renders a button. Typically, buttons have labels, but those labels need to be customizable. In case the custom value is omitted, it's good to have a default value. The button's label is the button label property, which we use in render's return attribute. We want this button's property to always include submit, even if the value isn't set from above. So to do this, we implement the default props static class attribute, which is an object containing the property button label with a default value, like this. The following parent component content renders 4 buttons. But 3 of these 4 button components are missing properties. Can we guess the result? The first button will have the label start, and the rest of the buttons will have the label submit. Setting default property values is almost always a good idea, because doing so makes your components more fault tolerant. In other words, your components become smarter, because they have a baseline look and behavior even when nothing is supplied. Let's take a look at it from another angle. Having a default value means you can skip declaring the same old value over and over again. If you use a single property value most of the time, but still want to provide a way to modify this value, aka override the default props feature is the way to go. Overriding a default value doesn't cause any issues, as we saw with the first button element example. Going back to the earlier example of the datePicker component, and the coworkers who weren't aware of the property types, well, we can set property types to use with React.js component classes, and we do so via the props type static attribute. This feature of property types doesn't enforce data types on property values, and instead it gives us a warning. That is, if we're in development mode and a type doesn't match, then we'll get a warning message in the console and in production. Nothing will be done to prevent the wrong type from being used. In essence, React.js suppresses this warning in production mode. Thus, props types is mostly a convenience feature to warn us about mismatches in data types at the developmental stage. Here is a basic example of defining a static props type attribute on a datePicker class with type string, number, and enumerator. You will notice that we have included this reference for the code snippet. This reference applies to all the code snippets used in this lesson, this module, and throughout this course. Let's continue with a fictional React project, but instead of a date picker, we're tasked with creating a component that's universal enough to use with any children we pass to it. It's a blog post content component that may consist of a heading and a paragraph, like this. Another blog post may consist of an image, like this. Both posts use content, but they pass different children to it. The this.props property is an easy way to render all children, and we can do more than rendering. For example, we can add a div and pass along child elements, like this. The parent of the content has the children h1 and p, where p means paragraph. The end result is that the h1 and the paragraph are wrapped in the div container with a class component. And obviously we can add many more things to a component, like content, for example. More classes for styling, layouts, and even access properties with interactivity, with events and states. With this.props.children, we create pass-through components that are flexible, powerful, and universal. We put the children in content when we want to instantiate the class, like this. The resulting HTML will have two div elements with content CSS classes. Our layouts, one will have h1 and paragraph, and the other will have span. And then coming up in our next lesson, we're going to explore the project structure and scaffolding, and we'll build a project to implement all the concepts that we've learned so far. Alright, let's continue to pretend that we work on a large team, creating components that other developers use in their projects. Let's see what higher order components can do for us. So let's say we're working on a piece of an interface. 3 of our teammates ask us to implement a way to load a resource, the React.js website, but each of them wants to use their own visual representation for the button, the image, and the link. We could implement a method and call it from an event handler, but there is a much more elegant solution: higher order components. And just in case you haven't figured it out yet, did you know that higher order components are not a part of the React API? They are the pattern that emerges from React's compositional nature. The component transforms props into UI, and a higher order component converts a component into another component. A higher order component is known as an HOC. It lets us enhance a component with additional logic. We can think of this pattern as components inheriting functionality when used with HOCs. So in other words, HOCs allow us to reuse code. And this in turn allows us and our team to share functionality among React.js components. And by doing so, we can avoid repeating ourselves. In essence, HOCs are React component classes that render the original classes whilst adding extra functionality along the way. Defining an HOC is pretty straightforward because it's only a function. We declare it with the fat arrow, like this. The name load website is arbitrary. We can name the HOC anything we'd like, as long as we use the same name when we enhance a component. The same is true for the argument to the function, load website. It's the original, not yet enhanced component. To demonstrate this, let's set up a project for our 3 co-workers. The project structure is 3 stateless components: button, link, and logo in Element.js, and the HOC function in load-website.js. Our co-workers need a label and a click event handler. Let's set the label and define the handle click method. The mounting events demonstrate the component lifecycle. We use displayName to distinguish child components from their parent. By default, JSX uses the class name as the name of the instance, or the element. Thus, elements created with an HOC in the example have underscore load website names. In JavaScript, an underscore is a valid character for a name. In addition, an underscore as the start of the name of a variable or a method typically means it's a private attribute, variable, or a method that isn't intended for use as a public interface. An underscore at the beginning of the name is a convention, meaning it's not enforced by the engine or the platform. It's solely a common pattern used and recognized by JavaScript software engineers. The spread operator lets us pass all the attributes of an object, which are obj, as properties when used in the element, like this. We use spread in load website.js to pass state and property variables to the original component when we're rendering it. And we needed it because we didn't know ahead of the time all the properties the function would take as arguments. Thus, the spread operator is a blanket statement to pass all of our data. In React and JSX, we can have more than one spread operator, or mix them with traditional key equal value property declarations. For example, we can pass all states and all properties from a current class, as well as class name, to a new element component, like this. So let's consider an example with children. In this scenario, using the spread operator with this.props, we'll pass all the properties of the done link to the anchor element, as in this example. In the HOC, we pass all properties and states to the original component when we render it, and by doing so, we don't have to manually add properties to remove them from render each time we want to pass something new, or stop passing existing data from content, where we instantiate load website enhanced component for each original element. Okay, so now that we've chatted about display name in JSX and React, let's take a look at how to use higher order components. Let's go back to inContent and content.js, where we're using load website. After defining the HOC, we need to create components using it in content.js, like this. Now we have to implement the three components, button, link, and logo, to reuse the code with the HOC pattern. The button component is created via load website, and as a result, it magically inherits its properties, this.props.handleClick and this.props.label, like this. The link component is created by the HOC, which is why we can also use handleClick and label properties, like this. And then finally, the logo component uses the same properties. Yep, you guessed it, they are magically there because we use a spread operator when we created logo in content.js. So as you can see, all three components have different renderings, but they all get this.props.handleClick and this.props.label from load website. The parent component content renders the element like this. There is a distinction that lets us scale our code in terms of code and team size. It's referred to as presentational components versus container components, and we did touch on them in the previous lessons, but now, because we know about passing children and HOCs, it'll be a little easier to reason with container components. So generally speaking, splitting our code into two types makes it simpler and more maintainable. Presentational components typically only add structure to DOM and styling. They make properties but often don't have their own states. Most of the time we can use functions for stateless presentational components. For example, logo is a good illustration of a presentational component in a class style, like this. Or in a functional style, like this. Presentational components often use this.props.children when they act as wrappers to style child components. Examples are buttons, content, layout, post, and so on, but they rarely deal with data or with states. That's the job of the container components. Container components are often generated by HOCs to inject data sources. They have states. Examples are save button and image post content, and so on. Both presentational and container components can contain other presentational or container components, but when we're starting out, we'll generally use presentational components containing only other presentational components. Container components contain either container components or presentational components. And we'd like to end today's lesson off with a word of advice. The best approach is to start with components that solve your needs. If you begin to see repeating patterns or properties that you're passing over multiple layers of nested components, but aren't using the interim components, introduce a container component or two. So it's lesson 7, and that means there must be a challenge for you to tackle. So after this lesson, we'd like you to create a new React project using create React app, and then use a higher order component that takes any component and returns a new one. And it's officially demo time. So in this demonstration, we're going to build an application to demonstrate higher order component usage. So at this point, I think you have the idea of what higher order components are in React and how they're used. Just as a little recap, higher order component function takes in a component and returns a new component. Its primary use is to reuse code and follow the dry principle in React. It isn't an API, and it's a design pattern that fits well within React. Alright, let's have a look at a single example to understand how HOC can be put into action. So I'm going to open up our examples folder, and then I'll create a new folder. So here I will right-click New Folder, and I'm going to call it Blog. Then I would open Visual Studio Code, and then from here, File, Open Folder. And then inside this folder, I go to my blog folder. So now I'd open up a new terminal to create a new project. So I'll use create React app by using npx create React app. And then our project name, which in this case is going to be a blog project. So let's have this as a small blog project, and then hit enter. Alright, so as you know, this may take a little bit of time. So just give it a few seconds. Alright, so now it's done and our project's been created. So I'll expand the project. And then inside the src, I have our app.js. So I'm going to delete everything inside this div. Delete. And then here I will write hello React. And then I'll save this, and then in the terminal, I will change directly to our project folder blog, or our project folder blog project. And then hit enter. And then here I will type npm start to check if the project is working. And then hit enter. And then this should open up a new tab of our project, showing hello React rendered to the screen. There we go, so now our project's working. So let's head back to Visual Studio Code and then create a new folder in the src. And I'm going to call it components. And then inside that component, I'll create a new file called, or a new component called bloginformation.js. And then I would create, starting by using import React from React. And this is going to be a functional component const blog information equal, and this will take props and then return a div. And then inside that div, I have h3 blog author. Blog author. And this takes props.author. another h3 for the article, and it's going to be the same, props.article. Okay, so now I'll save the file and I will export default our component's name. And then save. And I'll go to app.js. And then instead of returning hello React, so here I will return our component blog information. Blog information. And then I'll import blog information from /component/blog information. And then here I will pass what it says, Dave, and then the article equal new article. And now I save this. Oh, and I don't need the logo anymore. So I'll just take that out and then save the file. All right, and then I'll check the browser, refresh the browser. It says log information is not defined. And that's because we wrote it as log instead of blog. So that's in blog information, which is over here. Let me show you. So it will be blog with a capital. Okay, so let's save the file again and check the browser. Let's refresh the browser. There you go. And so far we've done nothing special. We just created a component and then called that component from the parent component. When we run this code, we will see blog, author, Dave, and article, new article. All right, so now let's start to think about enhancing this component. So what if we want to display the other name and no article written in the article section when no article is passed as props? So if there was nothing passed to the component, I want it to display a custom message. At this point, the component starts to grow. And keep in mind, we are still dealing with a simple feature that we can have all of this in one component. All right, so I'm going to tweak our blog. I'm going to tweak the blog information component just a little bit. So here in the article part, what I'll do is instead of returning props.article, okay, so here for this article, I'm going to pass an empty string. All right, let me show you. This article over here, I'm going to pass an empty string. And then if there is props.article, then return for me props.article. And if not, then pass this message, no article written. All right, so then I'll save the file. And now we're going to display no articles written if the article was not passed in the props. So let's take a look at this. So if we go to app.js, and now we're passing author and article. So if we check our browser, and then we're going to find Dave and new article. All right, so now if we delete the article from over here, delete, save the file. So now blog information component is taking author as props, and it's not taking article anymore. So now if we check this one, there you go. I find no article written. And that's the default message we are passing in the our component blog information.js. So if there is a props.article, pass the props.article, and if there isn't, then pass this message, the one that you can see over here. All right, now this is a good time to create a higher order component. All right, so let's go to our project. And then inside our component, I will create a new file. And I'm going to call it my HOC higher order component function.js. So here, import React from React, const my HOC function, equal, and this is going to take another component. And I'll call it my component, but remember you can call it any name you'd like. And this is taking props. And we'll return, so here if we check if props.author, if you provide props.author, then the following return my component. Do the following, return my component. And then I'm going to use a spread operator to pass props. And then I will close this, close off this else, and I will return a single div. And then inside that div, I will return h3. Return h3. And it's going to say there are no author at this time. And then I will save this component, and then I need to export default our component. So export default my HOC function. And now here, I'm going to pass our blog information component. So if the author exists, it will return the component with no changes. And if there is no author, then it will pass this message that we wrote. There are no authors at this time. So now I save the file, and then I will use this higher order function in our blog information component. So here, I'm just going to wrap our blog information with our HOC. So I'm going to type export default my HOC function. And do notice that when I press on it, it's automatically imported by installed extensions for us, which is wonderful. All right, so here I'm going to save the file. Alright, and then check the browser. And now it's showing blog author and the article, no article written. And that's because we haven't added any article yet. So now if we come back to our app.js and then add an article over here, so equal new article. And then save this. Again, I will see new article written over here. All right, so to test our higher order function, let's delete the author name. So if I delete the author name and then save the file, what should happen here is it will return this message. There are no authors at this time. All right, let's check the browser out. And there you go, there are no authors at this time. All right, so now anytime the blog information component is called, it will go to the higher order component, the myHOC function, and render that instead. So now you may have an idea of why HOC can be useful to you on larger React projects. And you may also be able to create higher order components to reuse a ton of code that would have otherwise just have been repetitive. Again, higher order component is just a design pattern, and you can opt to use it or not, depending on your coding style and preferences. And that brings us to the end of this tutorial. I'll catch you back in the lesson. And now we've seen how higher order components allow us to enhance the functionality of the component, and how the property types provide the security of type checking and no small measure of sanity. So you should be pretty familiar with most features of React. We've learned how to make our code more developer-friendly using property types, and our work more efficient using component names and higher order components. I'll see you next time, everyone. Goodbye from me for now.